Okay, welcome back. We are going to continue talking about rules, but this time we're moving from talking about the informal rules or tacit rules that we talked about with informal settlements to more formal rules, what we might think of as zoning regulations or top-down explicit codes, and how both of these have an effect on our built environment in slightly different ways. So I want to frame this a little bit in terms of these two different kinds of rule regimes. And to do this, I want to refer to the work of philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Deleuze is a philosopher who was very influenced by the sciences and complexity thinking and has become quite influential in the last 20 years or so, particularly since his works were translated from the French. He's very, very difficult to read, but he has some very kind of interesting perspectives in terms of how we frame society. And we're going to talk more about Deleuze when we get to sort of the philosophical interlude before we move to the last module. But I just want to introduce some of his ideas that relate to two notions that he has. One he calls state science, the other he calls nomadic science. And when he's talking about state science, he's talking about these sort of global rules that are imposed by a figure of authority, a figure of the state, whether it be a king or whether it be a government. This idea that you have rules that are imposed from the top down and that these rules are encoded, they're written down in stone, they remain static. In contrast to this, he talks about what he describes as a heuristic or a nomadic science. And this is rules that are learned through shared practice, like we talked about with urban informalities, and they are informed by the movement of information, that there's a kind of an awareness that you're informed by something, and then that influences how rules are enacted. These kinds of rules are much more step-by-step and responsive to the situation at hand. Because of that, they can be described as being contingent. In the same way that we talked about when you are baking a cake, there isn't an absolute rule that says you remove it after 20 minutes and you don't bake it for a second longer because that's the rule. Instead, you look at it, you say, okay, well, does it look brown? Does it look like it's finished or not? And then depending on that information in the situation at hand, the rule becomes contingent. Do I remove it now or do I let it bake for another 3 minutes or 5 minutes? So that's kind of the difference between these absolute rules and contingent rules. Both these kinds of rule regimes can lead to emergent outcomes. Deleuze would probably say that we're relying too much on these formal rules at the expense of these more informal, situation at hand, responsive rules that can be much more productive in certain situations. So to explain this better, let's look at a concrete example. And here, let's think about traffic organization in nomadic science versus state science. So here we have an example, North America traffic lights. This is state science. This is sort of an imposed rule that keeps everyone knowing exactly what we have to do. When we get to the traffic light, we stop. It's an absolute. Now, this makes a lot of sense because it keeps traffic very orderly, except when it doesn't. Think about the situation when it's a weekend, strange time of day, first thing in the morning, 5 a.m., you're driving someone to the airport, and you are at a stoplight, and it's staying red, and there is no one else on the road. There is no danger of you going through that stoplight that you're going to hurt someone. But the rules stay. You have to stay there, no matter what the situation is at that particular moment. And we've all had that frustrating feeling of just wanting to go through the red, but feeling like, oh no, I can't do that because I wouldn't be obeying the rules. So while the rules are productive in a lot of ways, we can also imagine situations where these static rules stop being appropriate for the situation at hand. Now, I want to compare this particular traffic situation to one that I experienced in Hanoi in Vietnam. And here we have a much more responsive, nomadic way of approaching the idea of an intersection and how to organize traffic. So I'm going to pause for a second and go to that video. Okay, so here we are in Vietnam, and let's take a look. Okay, so as we can see, there are no traffic lights in this instance. Instead, people just move through the intersection. And what's interesting if you're there as a tourist is that it's absolutely terrifying because you just have to step out into moving traffic and hope that the traffic around you steers around you. The worst possible thing that you can do is run. If you run, then the drivers don't know what to expect, and you risk getting run into. Um, but everyone understands in this context that you have to be taking account of what the agents are around you and what they're doing. And when I say agents, what I mean is, whether it's a bike or a vehicle or someone who's a pedestrian, that these are all agents in the system. And much like in the starling murmuration patterns, where we said each of the birds is reacting to the situation directly around them and making slight minor adjustments, here you have the vehicles and they are adjusting to the situation at hand and modifying their motions to respond to the agents that are around them. So it works. It works in a very different way from the North American examples. And I love this older woman who's walking by with the two baskets very calmly. Anyway, I think this illustrates this difference between these nomadic practices that are able to still yield this sort of emergent pattern of traffic flows that are uniform, that are moving through steady. Nobody has to stop. There's a kind of efficiency to this that doesn't exist in the North American context because we don't have these artificial stops within the system. There's also a bit of a risk and a danger to it. I don't know if that I would necessarily recommend this as a solution, but it's a different way of approaching the problem. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video and we will return to the main lecture. Okay, so we're going to go to a slightly different example of the unintended consequences of top-down rules. So this is an image of downtown Winnipeg, and the red is indicating surface level parking lots. And you can see that there is a vast amount of land that's devoted to surface parking. In fact, 41% of downtown is surface parking, which is one of the highest ratios of any city in North America. So the question is why? I mean, this isn't the best land use. Downtown land is expensive, so you would think that there would be better uses for it than allocating it for parking. But because of rules, there are some unintended emergent consequences, and this is one of them. There are rules surrounding how many parking spots you are required to provide for a office building and for a commercial building. And in order to satisfy those rules within the Winnipeg real estate market, it's too costly to buy, to build raised parking, elevated parking. And so the land values simply don't merit that construction. So instead, what you have is you have surface parking lots, and then if you can't afford to build a surface parking lot and a building, then you build in the suburbs. So it's a very strange thing that you have suburban sprawl while you have empty land downtown, and all of this is driven because of parking requirements. Unfortunately, Winnipeg is not an exception in this. By the 1990s, more than 50% of North American cities required 4 stalls per 1,000 square feet of commercial office space. And what's interesting in this number is that that means that the number of square feet you have to have 4 stalls is actually more than the amount of office space you're building for. It's 1,200 square feet to 1,000 square feet to get those 4 stalls in. So you're building into the zoning regulations this requirement that the city is going to feel like it's 50% a parking lot. And I don't think that that's what people had in mind when they thought, gee, 100,000 square feet, there's probably enough people working there. We probably should allow for 4 parking stalls. I don't think that they imagined that the consequence of that would be a sea of parking. But this is what's happened in a lot of North American cities. And now there's sort of discussions about, well, how can we change the characteristic of urban environments by changing some of the rules? Because as much as we as designers might like to think, okay, well, we are the ones who are responsible for creating the built environment, if the zoning regulations, if those rules are handcuffing us into certain situations, then the kind of beautiful street character and richness that we want to achieve simply won't be possible because of the rules that are constraining our acts. LA is another example of a city that had very, very high parking requirements. In LA, it was 1.3 stalls per bedroom. And because of that, you can see that the footprint of the parking stall winds up being almost half the size of the, or more than half the size of the apartments themselves. Similarly, the image on the right is showing the amount of surface parking required for a church and how much larger the parking lot is compared to the church building. Now in Europe, you don't have those same kinds of restrictions around parking. So if you've never been to Europe, or if you have been to Europe, one of the things that you'll notice when you do ultimately go is that there's a very, very different sense of the texture of the urban neighborhood. And this texture is coming about in large part because of how much the way we build is constrained around the car. Okay. The next thing I want to look at is just another example of what I'm calling in this slide, the missing middle. And this is probably something that you've never really thought about, but it's interesting when you start to notice it, is that we tend to, once we are talking about multi-residential complexes, so not single family homes, we tend to have two kinds of buildings that we see. One is the image that we see on the bottom, and that's characterized by it being a 3-story walk-up with a particular character. And I think you've all seen buildings that look sort of like this in Ames. The other seems to be getting into more like a 8 to 12-story building. And what do we have here? Yes, about 8 stories. And that there's this sort of jump. Like there's very little in between. You probably haven't noticed this, but if you start to take a look, you will hardly ever see buildings that fall somewhere in the middle between, say, 5 stories to 6 stories. It seems to be 3 or this jump from 8 to 10. And you think, well, what's going on there? Why is there this sort of break between these two kind of building typologies? And we don't have the richness of that middle size where things have got a different kind of texture, or a transition size where you can go from, maybe in your densest parts of your downtown, you've got taller buildings, but then there's sort of a gradation of buildings that go down to this more sort of suburban scale of 3 stories. We don't have that. So think about why. This would be a question that I would be asking in person in class, and I would sort of be waiting to hear some answers called out. But think about what your answer would be. Okay, so there are a couple of things that are at play here. The single most important thing is regulation surrounding elevators. So if you are building and you exceed 3 stories, you are required to put in an elevator. Lower than 3 stories, you can have it be a walk-up. As a result, the cost of putting an elevator is quite expensive. So it's very hard to justify an elevator to go up 1 more story. You basically have this huge expense that, say you've got 12 units you're renting out on a floor. Now, to get 12 more units, you have to put so much into that elevator that you're better off simply building your units on those first 3 floors without adding an extra floor. So it doesn't work out on the developer's pro forma spreadsheet of cost return. You have to then have a building where you can market it to a much larger population, so that jump up, in order to justify the cost of the elevator. So that's one constraint. The other constraint has to do with construction materials and the fact that typically you can build with wood frame construction, a cheaper wood frame construction assembly, if you are doing 3 stories. Once you exceed 3 stories, then you need to go into more fire retardant construction, which often would be concrete, although there's now other forms of timber construction that are able to meet those standards. But the point being that these are more expensive assembly technologies. And again, if you're getting into those more expensive assembly technologies, then you need the economies of scale that make it worthwhile. And we don't get that until we're at that threshold of around 8 stories. So this is really interesting because, again, it's changing the texture of what's possible within our cities, that we have this missing middle, and that it becomes very cost prohibitive to jump to that taller scale. So you'll tend to have more sort of suburban sprawl 3-story buildings and very little that's just outside the downtown at this mid-range. Continuing on about what is controlling our residential morphologies or shapes, I pulled this picture off the internet as a floor plan, and it's got some dimensions of rooms. And before I even added up how wide that apartment is, in my mind I said, well, it's going to be 27 feet. I know it's going to be 27 feet. And then I measured it, and it turned out 27 feet. So I'm psychic. I know these things from any random image. I can just understand this is the size of the apartment. How do I know? How did I know that this would be the module for this apartment? What's determining it? When I've asked this question before in class, often people have sort of said, well, is this a sort of an efficient structural bay? And that's not the answer. Any other thoughts that you might have about what is causing the 27-foot wide apartment to be a module of choice? Okay, so think about it, and we'll go to the next slide. And here we go. It's, again, we're returning back to the car controlling what we do in our environment. A parking bay is 9 feet. 3 parking bays is 27 feet. That sets up your structural grid. The fact that that 9-foot dimension is something that's been codified means that that is sort of rippling, has a ripple effect through the system to the fact that we build in multiples of 9 feet. Now, you want to have a multiple that's wide enough to be effective. If I say, well, I could build, apartment, I could build 2 bays and put columns at every 18 feet. Well, now I'm overstructuring it for building efficiencies. If I go too wide, then now I have a span that needs to be very, very deep. It's more costly. So 27 feet is kind of the best sweet spot we can get at, which means that virtually all apartments will be built on a 27-foot grid. This is not something that's up to the designer. It's something that's up to the parking bay sort of rules. If the parking bay rules were that you would needed to leave 9.5 feet per car, then we would have a different sort of building module that we would be building to. Continuing on with this, we talked about the 27-foot bay, but there's also something that happens in terms of the width of the building, not just the depth of the building, of apartments repeating after each other, but the width where you have the apartment, the hallway, the next apartment. That bay will almost always be 60 feet. And so again, like I don't need to measure this, I can just look at it and I know this is going to be 60-foot building and then a gap and then another 60-foot building. And so why is that? Again, think about parking. We go back to this idea of the depth of the parking stall and a car, the aisle, the next car, that amounts to 20 feet. And so that becomes the bay upon which we are building. So the overall massing of the city that we see in terms of its height, its width, its depth, all of this is being controlled by the module of the car. And think about how different this is in the older cities that were built before car transportation became the main way of moving around the city and car ownership became the main way of building. They didn't have these restrictions. So you get a very, very different texture to the urban morphology that's just coming from these rules of how we build. Similarly, suburban sprawl has got its own set of rules and codes. And when we go from suburb to suburb, they appear very similar regardless of the city that we're in. This image from above could be taken from Winnipeg, could be taken from Des Moines, could be taken from any city in North America. Why is this the same everywhere? Why is there so few ability to sort of shift from the norm? And this again is coming from a series of rules. So I love this image because it's so complicated. There's just red everywhere. And it's just talking about all the different things that have to be taken into consideration. Lot coverages, turning radiuses of roads, setbacks, maximum heights, driveway curb cut spacings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things wind up leaving you with very, very few degrees of freedom in terms of what you can do on the site in terms of building. And so this is what makes these neighborhoods appear to be so similar, are these sort of top-down rules that stay very, very rigid. If you have different codes, then you have different outcomes. So here we look at an image of Paris, and in this case, the buildings are going up to that 5-story level. And in this case, there are different rules. You're allowed to have a 5-story walk-up. And so if you're allowed to have 5-story walk-up, then why would you go lower than that? Because you can still profit from going up higher. The construction costs aren't that much higher. And so you wind up having a very, very different street character. There's also different rules in terms of that you would have a build-to line instead of a set-back line, which we have in North America. So this brings the building frontage right up to the street and turns the street into a kind of room. Again, the designers can still have freedom in terms of what they do with the surfaces and the texture, but there's a lot that's being set up by the rules that controls the overall nature of the design. In Amsterdam, we have a different set of rules that starts to control things. If we take a look at this is a canal house. This is one of the super skinny ones that tends to get photographed. So here, I think the width is, maybe 6 to 8 feet wide. Why would anyone build that skinny? It can't be for a practical purpose. It's not for a structural purpose. Again, you can try to imagine what is the rule that makes doing this make sense. And there are all kinds of canal houses in Amsterdam that are particularly skinny. And the reason is that the buildings in Amsterdam were taxed according to their length of their frontage for canal houses. So the longer your frontage, your higher taxes. You could go back further or you could go up, but the taxation was based on your width. So the skinnier you could make your space while still maintaining some functionality was better for you from a taxation purpose. And so from that rule, from that taxation law, you wind up with an emergent outcome of these very, very skinny buildings that appear all over the city. In New York, and this is an older image from New York, but in New York you had a rule that then also tended to give us this very characteristic New York skyline of these stepped towers that step back. And I think most of you know that this was the result of regulations that were trying to ensure that there was adequate sunlight at street level. And so there were all kinds of setback ratio calculations that you would do in order to determine what the nature of these steps would be in order to get you the required sunlight provisions within the street. And these are the regulations that then wind up creating this sort of beautiful stepped skyline. This isn't coming from the perspectives of the designer saying, oh, I want it to look like this. This is a kind of emergent outcome of the rules that are in place. And just as a last example relating to that, I like this particular drawing because we have the form of the building and then we have the plan that is actually showing the setback requirements of the building envelopes. And if you looked at the building initially and thought, oh, well, the architect was designing, trying to figure out, oh, the massing, I want it to be stepped a little bit more over here and then I'll do something special at the corner, had nothing to do with that. It simply was, what is the maximum building area that I can put within the setback limits? And let's build to those setback limits. And that's what generated the form. If you change a rule, you change the spatial consequences. So here we have Chicago, and there's an awful lot of open public space, and there's almost too much open public space. A lot of these public plazas are quite empty. They're not necessarily located in places that are the best for the public gathering. They can be quite windy. They can feel very desolate because you have these sort of blank office fronts and nothing commercial happening on the streets. So why are there all these public plazas? And the reason is that, some well-minded people in the planning department thought, well, we want more public space, so therefore we will allow builders to build higher if they provide public space at grade level. Now, this became an incentive, so a lot of people created these open public spaces. They didn't put a lot of money into that infrastructure. They would pave them, make them just there. Not particularly functional, but they would get their taller buildings because of that. And so this is that spatial consequence of all of these public spaces that don't really make sense from an urban standpoint in terms of urban functionality, but make sense from a builder's standpoint of being able to increase their overall building area within the city. So those kinds of rigid rules that are very, very inflexible, that aren't responding to the situation, is one way of thinking about it. But there can also be rules that are a little bit more relational, that rather than absolute, that they respond a bit more to the situation at hand. Seattle is an interesting example of this, in that they took a look at some of their commercial developments and they said, well, we want to maintain a kind of a street unity. So we don't want to have a situation where you have a very, very, 5 very small shop fronts and then suddenly like a big, long store on the same city block. So you're walking along and you don't have a consistent rhythm. So they said to keep that rhythm more consistent, we'll just say that no commercial frontage shall be larger than 1.5 the frontage of their neighbors. So this kind of imposes a limit. But it's not an absolute limit. It's based on what's happening relative to what's happening with your neighbors. This becomes a little bit more like this agent-based model where you take a look at what's happening with your neighbors and you adjust accordingly. You're still constrained by a rule, but it's a dependent rule that limits your freedom. And so we can see here how you could respond to this relational rule by still having a larger shop, but it would have to go in the rear yards of the surrounding shops, and you wouldn't be permitted a situation where there's this big jump in scale. So this is one way of kind of maintaining a kind of transitional unity and harmony. Maybe incrementally the stores could get larger, but you couldn't have these very, very abrupt shifts. And one of the things that happens in North America is you tend to have these very, very abrupt shifts in neighborhood character and texture of it, the urban environment. And so, whereas a lot of European cities, it feels like there's much more unity between properties. Okay, the last example that I'm going to talk about in terms of these unintended consequences is this idea of redlining. And for the many of you will have heard of this concept, you might not be quite sure what it's referring to. Redlining is the process whereby mortgage housing lenders would say some mortgages we want to say are too high risk, and we're going to designate areas of the city, redline them, and say these are too high risk for offering mortgages. And what that effectively did, it was intended to protect the bankers, but what it effectively did was it really, really accelerated urban decay because of feedback issues. So because no one could buy their own homes in those areas and get a mortgage, there was no incentive for people to maintain properties. The only people who were buying were then people who were landlords who could buy with money out of pocket rather than taking a mortgage and rent the properties. They weren't incentivized to keep these properties up. Homeownership tends to improve neighborhoods, but rentals tend to not improve neighborhoods because the landlord is just looking for their bottom line, and the renters themselves don't have incentives to look after the properties particularly well. And so you got these horrible feedback issues in North American cities where it was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. You would say, well, this area seems like it's a bit more at risk, so we'll redline it. And then because it had been redlined, it literally became way, way more at risk in terms of being a poor property investment. And some of the worst instances of neighborhood decay that we'll see are coming from this this one policy of redlining. People can blame it on, oh, well, you know, the population that was living in their poverty levels, but if you have home ownership, those things are not as big of a factor because people will maintain pride of ownership. But if you limit the ability of people to purchase their own homes and force them into a situation where they're renting, then you get these accelerating feedback issues and these real problems of neighborhood decay. So thankfully, redlining is something that it no longer happens, but it made a big impact in terms of when we talk about urban decay, why people were sort of fleeing these neighborhoods had to do with these kinds of policies. So we have to be very careful when we're thinking about what are the unintended consequences. Emergence is not always a good thing, and we have to be aware of how the rules that we put in place are creating incentives, creating constraints around what can and cannot be done. Okay, and we'll leave it there and move on to the next segment. Thanks so much.